The makeshift pet cemetery sat at the edge of our southern cornfield. It was in the shade of an oak tree my great-grandfather had apparently planted when he'd bought the land nearly a century ago. I had swung from the branches of that tree on a tire swing my dad installed when I was a child. The frayed rope still hung from a thick lower branch, swaying in a cool wind permeated by the smell of smoke. I stopped digging for a moment, wiping sweat from my face with the back of my forearm. The clouds were thick this afternoon, and the sun seemed to be giving up, retreating from the darkness now approaching from the east. It was a cool day, but the digging was hard work. The shovel's blade sunk into the dirt with a gritty, metallic sound as I jammed it next to the half-dug grave. I left it wobbling slightly as I removed what I called my Halloween jacket. It wasn't a jacket, just a flannel shirt, but it was night black and pumpkin orange, and I wore it all throughout October, much to my girlfriend's dismay. Walking over to the other two crosses nearby, I thought of the other dogs I had buried here over the years. Even when Chugger died, when I was only 10 years old, Dad had insisted that I bury him myself.
He was your dog,
my dad had explained to a much younger, tear-filled me.
You agreed to take responsibility for him. That means seeing him to rest. You'll be glad you did it later. Trust me on that one, Eddie.
And he was right. As I stood over Chugger's grave, I felt a sense of bittersweet pride. I felt proud of the wooden cross I had made for him, complete with his name engraved in the crossbeam. The construction and engraving both spoke to the amateur nature of the hands that had crafted them, but at least the thing had held up over all these years. The other grave marker had been built and engraved with surer hands. That was for my second dog, Reese, who had died when I was 15, just 3 years ago. Both of them had died of old age. I'd adopted both dogs when they were already full-grown. My parents refused to buy from a puppy mill, but I was thankful for the years I'd had with them. As I looked over at the wheelbarrow that held my third dog, Macy, the bittersweetness brought on by memories of Chugger and Reese were replaced by a seething and righteous anger. Macy hadn't died of old age. She'd been killed. And not by any other animal or a passing car. She'd been killed by someone, a person, with a blade of some kind. The fact that I would probably never know who killed her only added to my fervent anger. I laid my Halloween jacket over Reese's cross and stepped back over to the half-dug grave. Only 10 feet away, a wall of corn stalks swayed restlessly in a breeze. I thought I heard something deeper in the corn, like someone moving through the tall plants. Pausing with my hands on the shovel, I listened intently for some moments, hearing nothing but the far-off cry of crows and the distant bark of my neighbor's dog. I resumed digging, allowing my dark fantasy to resume with it. I imagined I wasn't digging a grave for Macy, but instead digging one for the psychotic asshole who killed her. Fancying myself as a John Wick character, I lost myself in childish imaginings of exacting revenge on a Russian gang who'd messed with the wrong dog owner. Of course, it was nothing but the daydreams of a person poised between childhood and adulthood. I still had the rest of my senior year to finish before I would be free of the fresh hell known as high school. But that wasn't the only thing keeping me from living my daydream. I had only ever been in a fight once in my life, and that was with my on-again, off-again best friend, Danny. The fight had been when we were both 16, and had anyone been there to see it, they probably would have laughed at the flailing punch slaps or the huffed exclamations when one of us finally landed a decent hit. Thankfully, no one had been around to see it, because it happened in my family's barn, and had been over something so stupid we often laughed about it whenever the fight came up. We'd been fighting over who was going to ask out our friend Andrea. This was back before we knew she liked girls. Even if she had been into one of us, it would have been stupid. and not anything worth ruining a friendship over. Still, I managed to keep reality away as I dug, transferring shovelfuls of dirt into a pile nearby. I had already gone over any of the ways I could think of to find out who'd been on our property last night, but they'd all been exhausted. Our doorbell camera hadn't caught anything, because the person apparently had been out here, near our southern cornfield. Why was a question I hadn't yet ventured a guess at. Our dogs always had free rein of the property once I got them trained up, so it was no surprise when Macy took off last night, barking madly and headed south. I didn't think much of it at the time, figuring she would come back through the doggy door like she always did. But she never came back. And I found her this morning in the cornfield, near Scully the Scarecrow, with multiple stab wounds up and down her white and brown body. More than anything, I wanted her to have died for a reason. Death had been on my mind even before Macy's unexpected murder. I'd been struggling with an ever-expanding chasm of nihilism in my life. My mom said it was because I had no plans after high school. Maybe that was part of it, and maybe it was just a byproduct of growing up and learning about the world. But now that I was burying my dog, the absurd chaos of life had me both seething in a raging forest of anger and drowning in dark waters of depression. Macy's death seemed so senseless. I wanted her to have died protecting us from something, but that didn't seem to be the case. Nothing was missing, and anything of value was on the other side of the property. I couldn't imagine what anyone would have been doing in the southern cornfield that late at night. I kept working. The dirt came out of the ground stubbornly. I dug until the hole was deep enough that she wouldn't be bothered by scavengers looking for an easy meal. Once again, I stuck the shovel in the ground and took a break. This time, I knelt next to the wheelbarrow that held Macy's body in its cold, metallic embrace. I placed one hand on her tarp-wrapped body and bowed my head, replaying some of our memories together as a way to say goodbye. Tomorrow, when my parents got home, all three of us would come out and have a little ceremony. But the burial was mine, and I wanted it that way. I wanted to be alone with her. While I was still taking a few moments, I heard that sound again, like someone moving through the corn. This time, it wasn't so easy to dismiss. I listened to the rustling for a good 30 seconds before deciding what I would do. I looked up at the oak tree under which I'd been working. Brilliant, orange-yellow leaves still clung to the tree. They would provide some manner of camouflage, and the branches would allow me to see over the corn. With a confidence that only came from knowing the tree as well as I did, I ascended to the thick branch from which the tire swing had hung and peered out over the sea of corn. I could see my house in the distance, about 200 yards away. I thought briefly about the guns in the house, a little of my revenge fantasy seeping out into the world. I dismissed the thought as patently ridiculous. I wasn't going to shoot anyone, not even if they had killed my dog. Instead, I trained my vision on the corn, looking for any evidence of movement not caused by the breeze. Scully the Scarecrow stuck up out of the corn about 50 yards away. I could also see the other scarecrow in the southern field, Sad Simon, off to the right, protecting his quadrant of the field. Both scarecrows faced away from me, toward the long driveway that divided the southern and northern fields. Peering around, I searched for the source of the noise. Then I saw movement. Something was moving through the corn, toward Scully, where I found Macy this morning. Some leaves blocked me from getting a good view, so I shifted, looking through a gap between the branches. A man in a tan-colored hat and a dark handkerchief pulled up over his nose, slowed as he came into the small clearing around Scully the Scarecrow. The distance, the brim of his hat, and the handkerchief all colluded to prevent me from seeing his face and possibly identifying him. He wore a backpack, which he slid off his shoulders before ducking down out of view. A moment later, Scully the Scarecrow shook on his stick, as if the guy was messing with him.
Is he trying to steal Scully?
I thought. The Scarecrow wasn't much to look at, and certainly wasn't worth stealing. The only notable feature was the fake skull I shoved in place under his straw hat every spooky season. Otherwise, he was your typical Scarecrow. Old overalls and a ragged plaid shirt stuffed with hay. I couldn't imagine why anyone would want him, but I also wanted to ask this guy a few questions about why the hell he was here, and maybe see if he carried a knife with him. I eased back down the tree branch. When I got to the trunk, I swung down and dropped, landing softly below with barely a crunch. After grabbing the shovel out of the ground, I started into the cornfield. Sneaking towards Scully, I tried to keep from stepping on any of the drying stalks or fallen corn leaves. This field, like our northern cornfield, was grown to feed livestock or for ethanol production, so it wasn't quite ready for harvest. We let the corn dry on the stalks before harvest because too much moisture is a bad thing in feed corn, unlike the sweet corn that people eat. This meant that creeping through the field without alerting the guy to my presence wasn't all that easy. To make matters worse, the closer I got, the more I doubted myself. My hands started to shake as my heroic daydreams evaporated like morning fog. What if this was the guy who killed my dog? Would he hesitate to kill me to cover up whatever he was doing? Was he a bank robber hiding his loot in our field? Or maybe a guy from the massive agricultural corporation that had tried to strong-arm my parents into selling our farm to them? Was he here to sabotage our crops? What happened next was either a product of my dread or distraction. I stepped directly on a broken corn stalk. The dry cracking sounded like a firework going off. I froze and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then there was a rush of movement as the man darted through the corn. I tensed, thinking he was coming directly for me. But it only took me a moment to realize he was running toward the road off to my left. His flight returned my confidence, and I bolted after him, my early trepidation gone. The only sound was that of my huffing and my feet crunching through the field as I ran. I couldn't hear him over the noises I was making, but I figured he wouldn't stop until he got to the road, and I was right. When I was still 20 yards from the road, I heard an engine start up. A few moments later, as I burst out of the corn, I saw a nondescript, dirty white truck hauling ass down the 2-lane country road. I thought of getting the license plate, but there wasn't one. I stood in the middle of the quiet road and watched the truck fade around a bend. What the hell was that about? I asked myself, chest heaving as I caught my breath. After a minute, I made my way back through the corn and up to Scully the Scarecrow. I inspected him, trying to figure out what the man had been doing, but nothing looked different. Maybe Scully's arms and legs were a little bigger, a little fuller, but that made no sense. Why would some random guy come repair our Scarecrow? Was this some kind of clandestine Scarecrow maintenance service? That was ridiculous. I looked up into Scully's face and said, "What was he doing with you?" Scully grinned back at me, teeth clenched in resolute silence, dark eye sockets staring past me as if I wasn't even there. "Fine," I said. "Keep your secrets." I headed back to finish burying my dog. Danny was the first to arrive, followed shortly after by Christian and Andrea. Grace was last to arrive, parking around the side and walking up to greet the rest of us on the front porch. She came up to me and sat in my lap, pecking me on the lips and then making a face at my Halloween jacket. "Are you going to wash this thing before Halloween?" "Don't listen to her," Danny said from his spot, sprawled on the wicker love seat. "A man's not a man unless he smells like sweat and cow shit." "Well, you're too much man for anyone then," Grace told him with a smirk. Danny flipped her off jokingly. At least, I thought it was jokingly. Sometimes I wished my best friend and girlfriend would just get along. Christian, a 17-year-old farm boy, and one of only a dozen black people in town, leaned against the porch railing with a vape pen in one hand. He puffed out clouds of sweet-smelling vapor that were dispersed by the wind. Next to him, Andrea sat on the railing with her legs dangling. She wore striped black and bright green leggings that complemented the rest of her witchy outfit. Grace wore skinny jeans, boots, and a baggy brown sweatshirt. Danny, Christian, and I all pretty much wore the same thing: jeans, boots, t-shirts, and some kind of utilitarian jacket. We weren't much for fashion. Since my parents were away at a farm equipment auction for the night, I had agreed to have my friends over, only after making it absolutely clear I wasn't in the mood for a party. They all knew about my dog, and so, for a change, they actually listened to me and didn't invite anyone else over. I was thankful for that. It was good to be with my close friend group, but I didn't want to do any more socializing than that. Danny pulled out a vape pen and took a hit. Unlike Christian's, this one wasn't exactly legal. At least, not the substance in it. He took a big hit and then passed it to Andrea, who did the same. Christian passed, and so did I, but Grace took a hit.
So you buried your dog?
She asked, getting out of my lap and sitting in the empty chair next to me.
Yeah,
I said.
She's in the ground. But something weird happened while I was doing it.
Danny perked up in his seat.
Weird?
I sighed. This was why I hadn't said anything about it so far. I knew exactly what Danny's reaction would be. Then again, a part of me wanted him to take the reins on this thing. It had been bothering me the whole time, as afternoon turned into evening.
Yeah,
I said.
Some dude was sneaking around in the cornfield. I chased him away. What was he doing?
Danny asked, his freckle-strewn face lighting up. He smelled mischief, and Danny loved nothing more.
That's the weird thing,
I said.
I don't know. He was messing with one of our scarecrows, but I don't know what he was doing. I didn't see anything wrong with it. You're kidding me, right?
Christian said, serious brown eyes fixed on me. My brow furrowed.
No, why? My dad chased someone off our property last night. He was near one of our scarecrows. My dad thought he was trying to steal it, but I have no idea why anyone would. That is weird,
Danny said, standing up.
Did you see what he looked like?
I shook my head.
Not really. He had a hat on and a handkerchief. Couldn't see his face. But he was driving a white truck without a license plate. What kind of truck?
Danny asked.
Ford? Chevy? Ford, I think. It had one of those covers over the bed. Extended cab or regular? I don't know, man. Why are you asking? It's not like we're going to do anything about it. How could we? Why the hell not?
Danny said.
If he's out there stealing scarecrows, I bet we can find his ass. Maybe he's the one who killed your dog. What? You want to drive around looking for a white Ford truck?
Grace said.
Sounds like a blast.
Danny ignored Grace's sarcasm and turned to Andrea, who'd been quiet on the subject.
Andy, you mentioned driving around and checking out Halloween decorations, right? How about we do that? And if we happen to come across some asshole stealing scarecrows, we'll tell him politely to fuck off.
I considered this. I had only been in one fight, with Danny, but he had been in several. It was something he enjoyed for some strange reason. Maybe because he was tall and muscular and rarely lost.
I'm down,
Andrea said. Everyone looked at me, knowing I would be the deciding vote after Andrea and Danny. That was the group dynamic. Grace and Christian were just happy to go with the flow most of the time.
Screw it,
I said.
But you're driving, Danny.
My friend smiled, and I got a flash of Scully's grin that sent a cold jolt up my spine.
I wouldn't have it any other way,
Danny said.
Think about it,
Danny said from the driver's seat of his 12-year-old Ford Explorer.
If he hit Christian's place last night and tried to hit your place but was driven off by your dog, then he's probably working away from town, right?
I shrugged from the front seat.
Who knows? That's a lot of inferences to make from limited information. Fair point,
Danny said.
But we have to start somewhere.
We had been stopped at the end of my driveway, but now Danny pulled out onto the 2-lane road and headed right toward town.
Trust me, I've got a feeling about this. Who else has scarecrows on this road? I don't know,
I said.
the Parkers maybe? The Simmons have some.
Christian said from the back. He sat on the driver's side, with Grace next to him and Andrea behind me.
They have a couple in the field and a couple more as decorations outside their house. Oh yeah.
I said, recalling seeing them from the road.
Okay, let's check the Parkers first, and then the Simmons. That would only make sense, right? Sure,
Andrea said.
but when we don't see anything, let's go into that new subdivision. I hear some of those people have gone all out with decorations. Ye have little faith,
Danny said, shaking his head. Off to our left, the sun was little more than a weakening light bulb on the horizon. The shadows stretched out, darkening the ground between the crops we passed. The occasional copse of trees seemed drenched in impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, I wanted to be in town, like Andrea said, where the street lights kept the deep dark at bay, and the silly Halloween decorations were a far cry from the stiff, human-shaped scarecrows that seemed to take pleasure in hiding in the night. By the time we had driven past the Parkers' farm and seen nothing, the last vestiges of sunlight were creeping away like beaten dogs. The Simmons farm was located down a narrow dirt road that I had often used as a shortcut to get to school back when my only means of transportation was a bicycle. I could cut across one of the fields at the far end of the farm and take 5 minutes off my ride. But now that I had a car, I hadn't been using Bull Hollow Road much lately. As Danny turned onto Bull Hollow, he turned his headlights off.
what are you doing?
Grace asked.
Relax,
Danny said.
I can still see fine.
We followed the road around a bend, bringing into view the back of a white truck parked on the side of the road, right next to a cornfield. My throat seemed to shrink, my palms going clammy. Danny laughed a low, mischievous laugh I knew well.
I told you.
The truck sat quietly about 40 yards away.
No way.
Andrea said from the back seat.
I doubt it's the same one. It's probably some farm worker, one of the Simmons' employees. Look at the license plate,
Danny said, voice low and slithery. He put the vehicle in park and shut off the engine. I sensed everyone leaning toward the windshield, looking through the gloom at the dark rectangle where a license plate should have been. A tense silence fell over the vehicle. Danny reached up and clicked off the dome light so it wouldn't come on when we got out.
You coming?
He asked me.
Ed.
Grace pleaded from the back seat. My body was alive with fear, like they were insects crawling under my skin. I was taking shallow breaths, but I couldn't stop thinking about Macy and how she'd been stabbed and left to die alone in that field last night.
Yeah,
I said.
I'm coming. Who else?
Danny asked. Everyone else was silent. I couldn't blame them.
There's a baseball bat and a golf club in the back,
Danny said.
Christian, would you mind? What are you going to do with those?
Grace asked.
They're just for self-defense.
Danny said.
Or did you forget that someone fucking killed Eddie's dog last night? This is stupid.
Andrea said, while Christian handed the 2 items up to us.
We should call the cops. We will, once we see what this guy is up to. Right now, there's no evidence he's done anything wrong, except maybe trespassing. Ed, please.
Grace said, reaching forward and gripping my arm.
Don't do this.
I looked at her in the dark car and said,
I just want to talk to him. Ask him what he's doing out here, that's all. Jesus Christ, you guys are idiots. What if he has a gun?
Grace said.
If he had a gun, he would have used it on Macy.
Danny said, baseball bat in hand.
Now, let's go.
He opened his door and stepped out. I did the same. We met at the front of the SUV and then started forward. As we got closer, we could see that the truck was empty. The guy was out in one of the cornfields, lining either side of the road. It was too dark to see where the scarecrows were in the fields, so I figured we would just wait for the guy. But as soon as we got up to the truck, Danny pulled a pocket knife out and jammed the blade into a back tire. The air escaping let out a hiss that was swallowed up by the rustling of the corn on both sides of the road.
What the fuck, man?
I whispered. Danny ignored me. moving up to the front tire on the same side and puncturing it.
Now let's see this asshole get away. So what now?
I asked. Despite my fear, Danny's brash behavior was giving me confidence. If I had been on my own, I wouldn't have had the balls. But with Danny here...
Now we wait,
Danny said.
Let's get down in the ditch over there.
He pointed to a ditch about 15 yards behind the truck. We crouched in the ditch and waited. I glanced back at the Explorer, unable to see anyone inside from this distance.
What if he sees your SUV?
I whispered.
So what? It's not like he can go far on foot. We'll catch him if he runs, because he's not going anywhere in his truck.
The sun was completely down, and the moon had yet to come up. The clouds blocked the starlight. We sat in the ditch, peering through the dark and listening to the eerie scraping of leaves rubbing against each other in the erratic breeze. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and saw a text from Grace begging me to come back to the SUV.
Put that shit away,
Danny hissed.
He's coming.
I realized he was right. That same sound I'd heard while digging Macy's grave filled my ears as the man moved through the cornfield across the road. Danny tensed next to me as the man neared the road. A vivid sickness twisted my stomach as I gripped the golf club in my sweaty hands. The same man I'd seen before stepped out from the tan-colored corn, still with his baseball cap and handkerchief on. He had a medium-sized backpack strapped over his shoulders that looked as if it was half full. On his right hip, he wore a combat knife in a sheath. Having come out across from his truck, he now headed directly for it. He stopped in the middle of the road, his eyes going between the two flat tires. Then his head whipped up and looked right past us at Danny's SUV parked down the road. Danny jumped out of the ditch just as the guy turned and darted back into the cornfield. My friend didn't say a word as he ran after the guy, his long, powerful legs pumping and bat-whipping back and forth in his right hand. I wanted to run back to the SUV to forget the whole thing, but I couldn't let Danny go after the guy alone. So I darted after the two of them. Leaves and heavy ears of corn hit me as I ran. Ahead, Danny let out something between a grunt and a shout. Then there was a loud thrashing sound, and I knew my friend had tackled the man to the ground, knocking down a bunch of corn stalks in the process. I came upon the area of flattened corn a moment later to see that Danny and the man were fighting over the combat knife, which was now out of its sheath. They were facing each other on their sides, fighting with the knife between them. I stepped over to the man and raised the golf club, hesitating as I sent it down into his ribs. He grunted with the weak impact, but kept on fighting over the knife. His hat had come off, and I could see the top of his head. He was balding, with short black hair and a horseshoe around his skull. I didn't recognize him.
Hit him harder,
Danny shouted. There was fear in his voice. He was losing. I raised the golf club and then brought it down on the side of the guy's head. I didn't use my full strength, but it was enough. He slackened for a moment, allowing Danny to yank the knife away. My friend scrambled to his feet and kicked the man in the chest twice before I yelled for him to stop.
Asshole was trying to kill me,
Danny said, voice high with the kind of fearful rage I hadn't heard from him before.
Guys?
Grace called from the road.
I called the police. Oh, great,
Danny said, looking at me.
The cops are coming. So?
I said.
Isn't that a good thing? I guess it'll keep me from killing this asshole.
Danny kicked the guy again.
Stop!
The man gasped.
Stop, please! We need to get out of here or we're all dead.
Grace, Andrea, and Christian were waiting by the guy's truck as we came out. Danny had one hand on the back of the guy's neck. His other hand held the knife poised just under his right ear at the jaw. I carried both the baseball bat and the golf club. With his handkerchief down, I could see him clearly. He was in his early 40s, just starting to develop the lines on his face that would be more pronounced in old age. He was clean-shaven and had a fold of slightly floppy skin under his chin, indicating he'd probably lost a significant amount of weight lately. When we reached the truck, Danny took the knife away and shoved the guy to the ground.
Sit down, ankles crossed and hands on your knees. Please,
the guy said after landing on his hands and knees next to his truck.
We don't have much time. If you and your friends want to live, we need to go. You can take me in your vehicle. I don't care. Take me to the police station. We just can't be here. Why not?
Andrea asked.
What's going on? Don't talk to him,
Danny said. He turned his attention back to the guy while sliding the knife between his belt and waistband.
What's your name? Please, you need to believe me. Something bad is going to happen very soon. Give me the bat,
Danny said, holding his hand out to me.
I'm going to break one of his arms. Maybe then he'll talk. Danny, don't do... Shut the fuck up, Grace,
Danny snapped.
Hey, man,
I said.
Calm down.
Danny stepped over and snatched the bat from my hands.
This guy killed your dog and he tried to kill me.
Danny said.
And you want me to calm down? Listen,
the guy said.
My name is John, okay? I'm John Halverson. Let's go to the police station right now. I'm in their system. I've been arrested before. Please, let's just go right now. What's in the backpack?
Danny asked. John shook his head.
Please don't do this. Give me the backpack. Hey, Danny, we need to chill until the cops get here,
Christian said. Danny ignored him and yanked the backpack from John's shoulders.
Don't open it, please,
John said. I didn't know this man at all, but his words and the fear that soaked them struck me as genuine. He was growing more terrified with each passing moment. Danny knelt in the road, set the bat down, and unzipped the backpack. He reached inside and pulled out a handful of hay.
What the hell? Why is this slimy?
Danny said, tossing the handful of hay onto the road. The stuff was coated in some kind of black goo, like old motor oil, and it seemed to reflect little bits of orange light from somewhere. He wiped his left hand on his pants, trying to get the stuff off.
Oh, Jesus,
John said, staring at Danny's hand.
Oh, Christ.
Staring wide-eyed, I noticed that John was wearing heavy work gloves, which also seemed to be covered with that strange goop. A rustling noise came from the cornfield behind us. Everyone looked that way. John screamed,
No, we need to leave.
He lurched to his feet, but Danny was too quick, whipping out with the bat and cracking John in the head with it. The man fell to the road, smacking into it so hard I knew he was unconscious, or worse. The rustling continued. There was someone out there, and they were coming toward us, taking sure, steady steps.
I've got a gun, asshole,
Danny said to the cornfield.
Your buddy already told us who you are, so you might as well give up now.
As he spoke, he pulled the knife out of his belt with his left hand, baseball bat still in his right. The rhythm of the steps didn't change. Whoever was out there was still coming. They didn't seem scared of Danny's lies. I backed away until I was next to Grace. Christian and Andrea stood nearby. The figure emerged from the cornfield and stopped, looking at us. Danny laughed.
Seriously? A scarecrow costume? Is that supposed to be scary?
Eyes that were just holes and tattered burlap turned toward Danny, who stood about 10 yards from the scarecrow. It wore a floppy-brimmed black felt hat with straw sticking out underneath. An old brown work shirt covered its torso and arms. Again, straw stuck out of the various holes. Same with the sun-bleached brown pants. I was sure it was a man wearing a costume at first, but that didn't make it any less scary. The wrongness of the situation caused my skin to go clammy and my mouth to go dry. Then I looked at the scarecrow's feet and saw no boots or shoes. Instead, sticking out from each pant leg was a tangle of dark roots in the shape of a foot. As the scarecrow moved toward Danny, my eyes darted up to its face. Its mouth was nothing more than a skewed tear in the burlap. But somehow, that mouth moved with intention. The scarecrow smiled. I wanted to believe it was just the wind stirring the mouth flap, but the way the burlap moved told me otherwise. It moved as if there were muscles underneath. Danny must have seen it too, because he backed away from the thing, just not fast enough. I only noticed that the scarecrow's right hand was made of a rusty old 3-prong garden cultivator when it whipped it up into Danny's head. My friend spun around from the blow and staggered away from the scarecrow, dropping the knife and gripping his injury with his left hand. 3 jagged gashes went from just in front of his ear down to the side of his left eye socket. They poured blood over his fingers. John was regaining consciousness, and he was now the closest one to the Scarecrow. The rest of us backed up, including Danny, who was cursing vehemently as he stumbled toward his SUV. John looked up from his spot on the road, his hazy eyes going clear and bright with fear. He screamed and tried to scramble away, but the Scarecrow stopped up to him and shoved him back down to the dirt road with one root foot.
I made you!
John said, pleading.
I'm the one who brought you to life. It was me.
The Scarecrow didn't seem to care. It whipped the metal fingers of its right hand up, jamming them through the bottom of John's chin. Blood spewed out of John's mouth as one of the prongs emerged through the bottom of his jaw. The other two prongs were on either side of his chin. Still holding him down with one foot, the Scarecrow yanked on his hand. John's head came up, spine crackling loudly. Then his jaw started to separate, skin stretching, tendons creaking. With a bowel-loosening tear, the Scarecrow ripped John's lower jaw away from his head. Blood and saliva splattered the road and John's nearby truck. Andrea and Grace screamed at the gruesome and near impossible sight. We all turned to run back toward the SUV, which Danny was just getting into. Before we'd made it halfway back to the vehicle, its engine came to life, and the headlights came on. For a moment, I thought Danny was going to leave us. As I ran toward the SUV, I looked over my shoulder to see the Scarecrow coming toward us. John's lower jaw still skewered in its right hand. The Explorer's engine roared as Danny drove toward us. We separated as he came to an abrupt stop, and we climbed inside. This time, I ended up in the back behind Christian and Shotgun. Grace sat in the middle, and Andrea behind Danny.
Turn around!
Grace said. Danny ignored her. I couldn't see his injuries because they were on the left side of his face, but I could see the expression of pure rage he wore. He hit the gas, and we barreled toward the Scarecrow standing in the middle of the road. It didn't move, and its ragged smile didn't falter as we picked up speed. Grace shrieked, and Christian jammed his hands into the dashboard to prepare for the impact. Andrea sat silently and leaned over to see out the windshield. The SUV jolted as it struck the Scarecrow, sucking it down under the grille. The tires on the right side bumped over it, one after the other. It wasn't like hitting a dummy made of straw. It was like hitting a real person, a big person. I spun around and looked out the back, seeing the Scarecrow illuminated in the red taillights as we drove away. It pushed itself off the road and started to get to its feet. But soon, it was lost from sight in the dark distance.
Someone else has to drive. My fucking face.
Danny pulled over and parked by a field.
Christian?
I asked from the back, knowing I was too jacked up to drive.
Fuck no, man.
He said.
Not me. I'm shaking like a goddamn leaf up here. What the fuck was that? Andrea?
Andrea swallowed.
Yeah, I can drive. I guess we'll go to the urgent care? Yeah,
Danny said.
No shit. I'm gonna need stitches and a tetanus shot.
The two of them switched seats, and Danny rooted around in the back for a moment, finding an old t-shirt to press against his face. I noticed remnants of the dark, oily liquid he'd gotten on his hand when he pulled that hay out of John's backpack.
What is that stuff?
I asked as Andrea started driving.
What was on that hay? I don't fucking know, man,
Danny said.
How would I know what that psycho was doing?
We all fell silent. Andrea turned at the next intersection, heading in a roundabout way toward town. The most direct route would have been back the way we'd come, but none of us were willing to do that. A minute passed.
I guess we should call the cops,
I said.
I already did,
Grace said in a hollow voice.
They're going to get there and see that guy with his jaw ripped off, and the dead guy in the Scarecrow costume. I don't think that was a person,
I said.
Didn't you see him getting back up after Danny ran him over?
Grace laughed without humor, shaking her head.
That's impossible. Danny killed him. But it's okay because it was self-defense. We all saw it.
We came upon a field of corn on our right. I forced myself not to look at it as we drove alongside the dark rows.
That thing got back up like nothing happened,
Danny said, t-shirt pressed against the left side of his face.
And you think a regular person could rip someone's jaw off like that? There's no fucking way.
What are you saying? Grace asked.
That it was a monster? Monsters don't exist, Danny.
I think we might have to accept that maybe they do, Andrea said from the driver's seat.
Maybe we should call the cops again and explain the Scarecrow,
Christian said.
Warn them. Go for it,
Danny said. Christian pulled his phone out. A figure lurched out into the road ahead. Andrea slammed the brakes, coming to a stop just a few feet from the Scarecrow that had darted out of the cornfield. This one was different from the jaw ripper. This one had a jack-o'-lantern for a head, its face illuminated from inside by some kind of sourceless orange light that did not flicker even as its grin expanded and its eyes tilted toward us in an expression of joyous evil. It wore overalls and a blue tunic, both of which were splashed with glistening red liquid. In its hands, which were covered with, or perhaps made of, old leather gloves, it held an ancient-looking scythe. A long second passed as everyone processed this. The first person to shout was Danny, saying,
"Run it over!"
Everyone else, including me, started shouting for Andrea to back up, or go forward, or go around the thing. She hit the gas, but the Scarecrow moved with purpose up onto the hood and then the roof. Andrea kept going, picking up speed, hands bone white on the steering wheel. We hadn't gone far from where we'd encountered the Scarecrow when the scythe blade pierced the roof above my head, catching the left side of my scalp just enough to cause a gash there over my ear.
"Get down!"
I shouted, slumping in my seat, pulling Grace down with me.
"Swerve!"
Danny yelled.
"Swerve, Andy!"
In her panic, Andrea did what Danny said, but we were going too fast, and she swerved too hard, losing control of the vehicle. We plunged off the road and into the cornfield. Andrea tried to course correct, yanking the wheel to the left. The vehicle whipped sideways, the tires digging into the dirt as the corn whipped against the side. Then we were airborne as the Explorer flipped. The inside of the SUV became a dangerous mess of flying bodies and pieces of shattered glass as the vehicle landed on its roof, slid about 10 yards, and then flipped onto the driver's side, where it came to rest. At some point, I smashed my head into the window, broke my nose on something hard, maybe Grace's head, and tweaked my right shoulder. For all I could tell, it had all happened at once, because there was no picking out moments from that chaotic crash. None of us had been buckled in, and we all ended up smashed together on the driver's side of the SUV. Grace, Danny, and I in the back, Christian and Andrea in the front.
"Everyone okay?"
I asked, crawling into the cargo area to get off of Grace and Danny. It was a strange thing to ask, because I didn't even know if I was okay. Andrea was the first to say something, which was rare for her.
"Oh my God!"
she said in a tone I'd never heard from her.
"I broke my leg!"
She sobbed.
"Jesus, I can see bone!"
Somehow, my body dumped more adrenaline into my bloodstream at these words, and at the sudden memory of why we had crashed. Grace whimpered as she crawled off Danny and joined me in the back. Blood streamed down from her nose, and she had a nasty cut on her left eyebrow, but otherwise, she looked intact. Danny pushed himself up and started coughing.
"We gotta get out of here!"
From the front, Christian grunted as he steadied himself.
"We're gonna get you help,"
he told Andrea.
"Shh,"
I said, hearing footsteps approaching through the corn. I couldn't see well out the back because the roof collapsing had caused the back window to break, but the glass was still partially intact with white spiderweb cracks. Everyone but Andrea froze. She was still sobbing. The footsteps grew closer and stopped outside of the vehicle next to the roof that was now the wall. Nothing happened for a long moment. I looked straight up, through the broken-out side window over the cargo area, and saw nothing but a dark, cloud-choked sky. The SUV suddenly jerked, tilting violently over and landing upright on its wheels as the shocks groaned in protest. Grace and I ended up next to each other in the cargo area. I got to my knees and looked out, seeing the pumpkin-head Scarecrow standing there with its scythe. Andrea screamed and tried to open her door, but the metal was bent where the door was still locked. She didn't get out, but she did attract the Scarecrow's attention. It stepped over to her glassless window and whipped the scythe through the opening. From where I was, all I saw was Andrea's head whip back against the headrest. In almost the same instant, the tip of the scythe pierced the back of the headrest, like it had gone all the way through her head. Pandemonium encompassed the vehicle. Christian threw himself out his window, while Grace and I scrambled out the side window that had been facing the sky only moments earlier. As we ran into the cornfield, hand in hand, I glanced back and saw the Scarecrow standing outside Danny's window. And I saw Danny still in the car, apparently unable or unwilling to move. I slowed down, wanting to help my friend, but Grace pulled me along, and I knew that there was nothing I could do for Danny. He was already dead. We rushed headlong into the cornfield, fear driving our legs and turning our breath sour as we ran for our lives. The dry scrape rattle of the corn was like a calling card. As Grace and I put some distance between us and our attacker, little bits of logic seeped back into my brain. We had to be smart about this. I slowed down, yanking on Grace's arm. She turned, eyes wild with fear, ready to say something, but I shook my head and pressed a finger to my lips. At my urging, we eased down amid the stalks of dry corn and sat, listening. There was rustling from two different directions. There was just enough wind to sway the tops of the plants gently. But after we'd been still for about a minute, the wind picked up again, rolling in waves across the sea of corn. "Go," I whispered. We rushed through the corn, the wind covering the sound of our escape until the wind died down, at which point we stopped running and hunkered down again. Footsteps pounded the earth from nearby, growing louder as they came nearer. I still had hold of Grace's hand, so I felt her tense as if to bolt. I redoubled my grip and held her in place, shaking my head. The footsteps kept coming, steady and even. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake by staying put. I thought I'd just gotten us killed. But the footsteps moved past us in the dark, 3 or 4 rows away, just missing us. The wind picked up again, but we stayed put this time. When it died down, we could hear the footsteps fading into the distance. We waited. I could feel Grace shaking, the tendons in her hand thrumming like guitar strings. When the wind picked up again, we bolted, heading opposite of where the footsteps had gone. My sense of direction was all screwed up, but I realized where we were when we came out on a road. We weren't that far from where we'd come into contact with John and the first Scarecrow with the burlap face. I kept pulling Grace along, starting down the road.
"Where are we going?"
she asked.
"Back to where we were,"
I whispered.
"The police should be there by now." "No!"
she shrieked. I jerked on her arm.
"Shh! It'll hear you!"
After peering around and seeing no sign of any Scarecrow, I pulled Grace into the ditch at the side of the road. We crouched down.
"We need the police,"
I said.
"I'll bet they're there by now." "Why don't we call them?"
she asked.
"Because I don't want to be talking on the phone. Those things might hear us." "We can text. That's something you can do, right?"
I nodded.
"That's a good idea. Text them and tell them where we're headed. If we don't see any police there, we'll head across the field and back to my house, okay? I have guns there. We can lock ourselves inside and wait until the police catch these things." "Things?"
Grace said.
"Eddie, they're people. Psychos dressed in Scarecrow costumes. Like what happened in Iowa a couple of years back."
My mind exploded with realization. I had completely forgotten about the news from several years ago that had so shocked my parents. It was barely a blip on my 15-year-old self's radar. 14 people had been murdered in a small Iowa farming town when several men had dressed up as scarecrows and went on a killing spree. 4 migrant workers had been arrested for the crimes, although the physical evidence was lacking, and all 4 men had maintained their innocence, although none of them could account for the time during which the murders had occurred. But I knew this wasn't the same thing. The Scarecrows that had killed John and Andrea, and probably Danny, weren't people in costumes. They were something else. Grace refused to believe what was right in front of her eyes, but I knew this wasn't the time for an argument. so I nodded and said,
"You're right. So the cops will handle them. No problem. Let's go. We have to go that direction to get back to my house anyway."
Grace nervously licked her lips and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with her free hand.
"Okay."
She pulled out her phone and texted 911, telling them we were going to be about halfway down Bull Lick Hollow Road, where John's truck was parked. Then she put her phone away, and we resumed our journey. We stayed in the ditch this time, running along in the wild grass so our footsteps wouldn't be loud. For a change, I was glad it hadn't rained lately. Otherwise, we would have been tramping through mud. 10 minutes later, after turning back onto Bull Lick Hollow Road, I saw the flashing red and blue lights in the distance. I couldn't see John's truck or the police car because of the bend in the road, but the lights gave me hope. Grace and I shared a look in the dark, smiling grimly. We hurried around the bend, still staying in the ditch, and saw the white truck right where it had been parked earlier. John's body lay nearby, but it was in a different position from before. He was still on his back, but his stomach had been ripped open and his insides were strewn all over the road. The police SUV, with its light flashing, was parked a good 15 yards further on, behind the truck. I saw no sign of a police officer and no sign of a Scarecrow. I figured the cop was still in his car, maybe waiting for backup to arrive.
"Did they text you back?"
I asked Grace. She pulled her phone out and looked at the screen. Her face looked especially pale in the light from her phone.
"No,"
she whispered.
"They haven't called either. Maybe they're already on it,"
I said.
"Busy apprehending these guys."
Grace nodded, but I knew she didn't believe it any more than I did. We eased forward. I told Grace not to look at the dead body, but I doubt she took my advice. I knew I couldn't look away from the gory scene. We came alongside the truck, and as we passed, I glanced in the window. A small backpack sat in the front seat. I didn't think much of it then. I was too concerned with getting to the cop. As I passed the truck, I put my hands up and walked up onto the road, noticing out of the corner of my eye that John's backpack was there. The hay that Danny had pulled out was still lying on the dirt road, although it had been scattered a little by the wind. The dark substance on the straw seemed to glitter faintly with orange light.
"Hello?"
I called toward the police car. Grace also had her hands up as she walked a few yards behind me. I couldn't see into the police car because of the headlights and the hazard lights, but the door didn't open. My guts started to squirm with unease.
"Hello? We need help."
Still nothing. We came to the cop car, and I knocked on the window, then peered inside.
"It's empty,"
I said to Grace. I looked around and then walked toward the back of the vehicle, bringing another dead body into view. I flinched as soon as I saw the cop there. His face had been torn off. As I got closer, I could see the sharp divots in his torn flesh. Divots from the Scarecrow's metal hand. The guy lay amid spent shell casings, and he had a pistol held lightly in his right hand. Grace, who came up behind me, made a sound that was a half scream and half whimper. I turned around and pushed her toward the police car.
"Get in,"
I said.
"and lock the doors." "What are we doing?"
she asked.
"Just get in,"
I said. She opened the door and got into the back. I started jogging over to John's truck. I recalled John's words before he died, saying something about how he had created the Scarecrow or brought it to life. I tried the driver's side door. It opened, but the light didn't come on. I reached in and grabbed the backpack from the passenger seat and moved to the back of the vehicle. There was a cover over the bed, so I opened up the tailgate and peered inside. There was a single, incomplete bale of hay back there, with about half of its mass missing. It was covered in that black oil, and it gleamed with faint orange light. I shut the tailgate and ran back over to the police car. I got into the driver's seat and put the thing in gear. After making a 3-point turn in the road, I headed back toward my house. The police radio was on in the car, but no one was talking over it. Only static silence filled the vehicle as I drove. Grace cried in the back seat until we reached my house. The place was completely dark as we approached, making my guts squirm again. The power had to be out. I knew I had left the porch light on. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights splashed the front of the house. I slammed on the brakes, keeping the headlights on the figure standing on my front porch.
Danny?
I said. My friend, looking on death's doorstep, waved with both hands and ran toward the vehicle. I put it in park and jumped out.
Danny?
He slowed as he came near, his face falling.
I thought you were the police. Where'd you get the car? Where's everyone else? I thought you were dead,
I said to him.
How are you not?
Once all the doors were locked and both Danny and I had guns at the ready, we caught each other up. We sat in the upstairs bathroom at the back of the house, where we cleaned and treated our injuries as best we could. Grace was working on the deep gashes on Danny's face, trying to clean the strange goop away before she bandaged them. I tried not to stare at the little specks of orange light that came away from his wounds.
I don't know why it didn't kill me,
Danny said.
He was looking right at me. It even reached inside and grabbed me by the neck. I don't know what was in those gloves, but it didn't feel like any fingers I've ever felt. It was like being choked by a thick tree branch. I thought for sure the fucker was going to crush my throat, but it pulled me half out the window and kind of looked at me, like it was inspecting me with those freaky, empty jack-o'-lantern eyes. Then it just let me go and took off through the cornfield. I thought it was going after you guys. I think it did,
I said.
I think it walked right past us in the field.
I paused.
I hope Christian's okay. I hope he got away. Yeah,
Danny said.
You guys keep saying it.
Grace said.
Why? There was a person in that costume. A man.
Danny and I shared a look. He cast his eyes down.
Yeah,
I said.
You're right.
While Grace worked, I tried calling 911 again. The call wouldn't go through. I tried calling my parents, but nothing was working. No calls went through on any of our phones. It seemed the towers were either down or overloaded with emergency calls. With no power, we had no internet, so that was a dead end too. Once we had our respective wounds cleaned, we barricaded ourselves in my room, which was upstairs at the very back of the house. With only one door and a window that led out onto the roof, I thought it was as good a place as any. I had the house locked up tight, but if something did come in and try to get through the door, we could climb out onto the roof over the sunroom and jump down into the backyard. Grace and I sat on the bed, while Danny sat on some pillows on the floor. I had a Mossberg pump-action shotgun nearby, while Danny had a Browning hunting rifle. After a couple of hours of nothing happening, I grew drowsy, drained from the after effects of so much adrenaline and stress. At some point after midnight, I fell asleep.
Wake up, Eddie, wake up.
I opened my eyes to Grace's urgent whispers as she shook me awake. I sat up in bed and looked around the dark room.
What? Danny's gone, and I heard a noise from downstairs.
Sure enough, my dresser had been moved from behind the door, which now stood open to the gloomy hallway. The Browning rifle I'd given Danny lay on the floor next to his pillows.
Did you see him leave?
I asked. Grace shook her head.
No, I woke up just now when I heard something downstairs. It sounded like a door opening, like the front door. Shit,
I said.
Okay, stay here and keep the door locked.
Grace nodded as I climbed out of the bed with the Mossberg in my hands. At the top of the stairs, I whispered,
Danny.
There was no answer. I heard a faint thump, like a kitchen drawer closing.
Is he getting a fucking snack right now?
I thought as I made my way down the stairs. I kept the safety engaged on the shotgun, not wanting to accidentally blow my friend away just because I was scared enough to pee my pants. As I stepped into the kitchen, I saw Danny standing near the back door, which was partially open. He was facing away from me with his head slanted down, and he was doing something with his right hand up around his face. A strange squelching sound filled the kitchen. Liquid splattered the tile floor between his feet.
Danny,
I hissed.
what the hell are you doing?
My friend stopped what he was doing and turned around. He moved left as he turned to face me, and the first thing I noticed was that he was no longer wearing the bandages Grace had put over the gouges made by the Scarecrow. In those gouges, his skin glistened with a faint orange hue, like dying embers poking through the dark ashes of a house fire. As he finished turning, I gasped. He held a steak knife in one hand, having clearly gouged his own eyes out with it. His sockets were pits in his skull, but they weren't completely dark. Somehow, an orange glow emanated from inside those gory pits. He smiled wickedly but said nothing as he started toward me.
Danny?
I said, backing up, not sure what to do. I bumped into something behind me, something that shouldn't have been there. Gasping, I stepped away and turned around to see Scully the Scarecrow staring down at me with his skeleton grin and orange glowing eye sockets. He whipped an arm out, smacking me in the side of the head with a hand made of tough, knotty roots. I crashed into the wall, my skull putting a hole in the sheetrock. I inhaled drywall dust as I collapsed to the floor. Danny stepped over me on one side, Scully on the other. They looked down with almost identical eye sockets. I figured the Mossberg's safety off and whipped the barrel up, firing the gun at Scully's chest. He flew back along the hallway, trailing a confetti cloud of shredded straw. I worked the pump, ejecting the spent shell and loading another one into the chamber. Before I could fire at Scully again, Danny kicked the shotgun out of my hands. It flipped through the air and landed several feet away between me and Scully, who lay on the floor like an abandoned dummy. I flipped over and tried to get to my hands and knees, but Danny fell onto my back. A searing pain flared in my right shoulder blade, and some part of me knew that I'd been stabbed by my best friend. Shouting, I bucked and slammed my right elbow back, connecting with Danny's head. The blow knocked him off, allowing me to scramble up and lunge for the shotgun. Danny caught my leg at the last second and yanked me down. Another jolt of pain erupted from my shoulder blade. The knife was still in it. I flipped onto my side and kicked Danny with my free foot. He fell back again, this time crashing into the side table in the hall, knocking off an old vase. The ceramic vessel shattered on the hardwood floor. With my leg free again, I turned around and grabbed the shotgun, pulling it toward me even as I saw Scully getting to his feet. Some distant part of my brain registered a noise from upstairs. Grace was screaming my name. Then there was a gunshot from up there, and another. I heard ceramic crunch from behind me as I got to my feet. Danny was coming. I twisted around, bleeding with the butt of my shotgun, and caught Danny in the jaw with it. He staggered into the side table, then fell onto the ceramic-covered floor. As I turned back around, Scully grabbed my shotgun with one hand. Before he could push it away, I fired. The shot hit him in the shoulder of his opposite arm, blasting the appendage off in an explosion of hay. The blast seemed to shock him momentarily, allowing me to yank the gun out of his hand and work the pump again. I aimed and fired at his head, blasting the now too real skull away. It didn't stop him. He stayed standing, reaching back out with his one remaining hand. I worked the pump again and fired again, this time blasting off his right leg. Scully fell to the floor, but he worked his one arm and one leg, squirming toward me. I took a step back as I worked the pump again, frantically trying to remember how many shells the shotgun held. But all coherent thought was momentarily obliterated as excruciating pain detonated on the back of my right ankle. I screamed and instinctively brought my right foot up, twisting around to see Danny sitting behind me with a shard of ceramic in his hand. Blood soaked my sock and poured into my boot from where he'd severed my Achilles tendon. The pain-induced rage clouded my mind as I turned the shotgun on my friend and fired, decapitating him with the blast that splattered his skull and brains all over the hallway and into the kitchen beyond. A vice gripped my left ankle, and I looked down to see Scully grabbing it. I loaded another shell into the chamber and blasted his arm off. His hand went limp, and I hopped toward the stairs, feeling lightheaded from my injuries. Grace had stopped screaming, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly when.
Grace?
I yelled as I hopped up the stairs, unable to put any weight on my useless right foot. There was no answer. She had been screaming my name, I knew that. And there had been gunshots. I hoped the rifle Danny left had allowed her to protect herself. Worry compounded my lightheadedness, and I nearly tumbled backwards down the stairs as soon as I reached the second floor. I gripped the railing and gathered myself. I could hear something from my room, but it was a faint noise that I couldn't place. I hopped down the hallway, shotgun in one hand and the other against the wall for support. The noise grew louder as I approached. My guts coiled as I came to my bedroom door. I hopped into the doorway and brought the shotgun up. Someone I recognized leaned over Grace, who lay on her back on the bed. I could only see her legs from where I was. The rest of her was blocked by this familiar figure that I couldn't quite place at first. Then it clicked. The maroon plaid shirt and the threadbare blue jeans. It was Sad Simon the Scarecrow. I couldn't see his head because he had it craned down to look at what he was doing. I didn't want to see his head. I didn't want to see his creepy, sad burlap sack face or what he was doing to Grace. But, sensing my presence, he paused what he was doing, straightened up, and stepped away from the bed, half turning toward me. He still had her intestines in his root hands, and he looked at me with his downturned mouth and slit eyes that glowed with that same faint orange light. Her guts trailed from her torn open abdomen to his hands, but some of them had been piled next to her on the bed. He'd been pulling them out and throwing them down on the pile, each time making that splat noise. I stared in disbelieving horror, looking at my dead girlfriend on the bed, her eyes trained on the ceiling. But then she blinked, and her head came up, and she looked at me. I screamed and blasted Sad Simon's head away. I worked the pump and tried to fire again, but it was empty. The box of shells I'd brought up was on my desk just inside the door. I yanked it open and loaded another shell into the shotgun as Sad Simon stumbled toward me. I went for his legs this time, and he fell to the floor, allowing me enough time to load a couple more shells. Yelling at the top of my lungs, I blasted Sad Simon's remaining limbs off. I don't know if it was the fact that I'd seen nearly all my friends killed, or the stress of the night, or the loss of blood, or maybe some combination of it all, but I went into a kind of fugue state. I saw bits of that strange oil-covered hay bulging from Sad Simon's arms and legs and chest. Crying and shouting Grace's name, I gathered a bunch of the stuff up and jammed it into Grace's abdomen. I kept shoving fistfuls of the stuff into her. She kept shaking her head and crying and saying, "No!" over and over again. But I kept putting that stuff into her. I lost track of time after that, and when I came to again, I was sitting on the floor against my bed. I had pulled the knife out of my back and wrapped a handkerchief around my ankle. Sensing movement, I turned and looked at Grace's body. Her limbs were twitching. I scrambled to my feet and backed away to the door until I saw the bits of discolored straw sticking out of her torn open stomach. I didn't remember what I had done. Grace opened her eyes and sat up on the bed. She looked at me and smiled. Her eyes glowed orange. I couldn't take it anymore. I just fled. I hopped down the stairs and out of my house and got back into the police SUV. I couldn't use my right foot, so I had to drive with my left, which was awkward, but I soon got the hang of it. I passed Christian's house on my way, seeing that it was engulfed in flames. The last time I had seen him, he was running away from the crashed SUV. I hoped he'd kept running. I hoped he hadn't gone home. If he had, I figured he was dead. Bodies littered the few front lawns I passed. I didn't see any scarecrows, but I could feel them looking at me from their fields as I drove. I eased the pedal down as much as I dared, afraid of crashing like Andrea did earlier. But I made it out of town without incident, and I didn't stop until I had cell service again. I parked at a truck stop and called the police, and I told them what happened. I told them everything. The 911 operator thought I was crazy, but he sent the police my way. While I waited for them to show up, I noticed the small backpack I'd taken from John's truck. I opened it up and found a recording device. I listened to it, to John's confession. He started off by saying that his wife and kids were being held hostage by people who worked for Agri-Giant, the same company that had been trying to buy up all the farms in the area. According to John's recording, the Scarecrow massacre in Iowa a few years back was orchestrated by the corporation, and the migrant workers they pinned it on were innocent. I wanted to know how it worked, how the hay brought the Scarecrows to life, and how it brought people back. But John said he didn't know, only that it did work. At one point, he broke down crying on the recording. As I listened, I gripped the device harder and knew he was talking about my farm and my dog.
"The dog was the last straw,"
John sobbed.
"Last night, I was stuffing a scarecrow, and this dog came running out of the farmhouse and attacked me. I didn't even think. I just killed it. Then As I knelt there in the dark, with this dog's blood on my hands, I knew I couldn't do this anymore. I ran away and told them I was done.
John paused, the only sound his hitching breath.
Then they sent me the pictures of my family, told me I had to finish the job today, tonight. So I tried, for my family's sake. I tried, but I can't do it. I mean, I don't care anymore about my life. I don't want to live anymore. I can't live anymore. I know there's no saving my family at this point. Even if I did what they wanted and got my family back, I could never look them in the eye again. Not with all the things I've done for this company over the years.
He paused, crying for nearly a minute.
But that dog I killed, it's just too much. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They're going to kill my family, but I don't know what else to do.
John's voice grew darker as he talked, shifting from a sorrowful plea to a sinister whisper.
They only told me to target 4 farms, but I've been stuffing every scarecrow I see. There's no turning back now, and this is the only way I can think of to blow their operation up. They won't be able to cover up the massacre of an entire town, but they'll try. They'll send people out to sabotage the power grid and the phone towers so they can contain this thing once they realize I've gone off the rails. But I'm going to be punished for this thing. Then, so will they. That's why I'm doing this. They're playing with powers they don't understand, that no one understands. But maybe, after tonight, someone will step in and stop them, because I'm doing all I can.
He paused, and when he spoke again, the sorrowful plea was back in his voice.
I just keep seeing that dog I killed. How she looked up at me as she died.
He snorted harsh laughter.
All the people I've killed, all the lives I've ruined, and it's a dog that finally gets to me. A fucking dog.
The recording ended just as the police showed up at the truck stop. They pointed guns at me and yelled, but I was so happy to see them. Macy had died for a reason. Her death wasn't pointless. I felt like I could finally rest. As I got out of the police SUV, hands up and empty, I looked at the eastern horizon. The sun was just coming up. It had a faint orange glow to it, like a dying coal poking through the ash in a cozy fireplace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.